Shadows of Certainty, A Skeptic's Awakening, a Bedtime Story. In the quiet serenity of his study, surrounded by shelves laden with scientific literature and awards, Edward sat in quiet contemplation. At 55, he was the epitome of a self-made man, the CEO of a renowned research firm. His life was a testament to the power of human reason and the pursuit of knowledge. Raised in a Catholic family, Edward found himself drifting away from faith in his youth, embracing a quasi-atheistic stance. While he didn't completely deny the possibility of a higher power, he leaned heavily towards skepticism, especially towards narratives of virgin births and resurrections. Edward cherished his time at the local pub, a cozy nook at the heart of his small rural town. It was here, in his favorite spot at the end of the bar, that he often caught up on emails and work outside of the office. The pub was like a second home, a hub of community life where family and friends regularly gathered. For Edward, it was more than just a place to unwind. It was his alternate workspace, infused with a warmth and familiarity that he had always hoped to find in a local pub. They've been living here several years now, and he feels fully woven into the fabric of the town. One evening, as he sipped his usual pint, Edward decided that the pub would be the perfect setting to embark on a creative endeavor, a written exploration of his skepticism. He hoped to channel his thoughts into a short story or an essay, a project that would not only serve as a creative outlet, but also articulate his stance on faith or the lack thereof. Deep down, he harbored the hope that his literary venture might enlighten his devout wife and friend, persuading them to see reason. As he pondered over his laptop, pen in hand, Edward resolved to rely on the one thing he trusted most: science. He planned to delve into molecular research, his area of expertise, to dismantle the notion of a divine entity. Unbeknownst to him, this journey would challenge the very foundations of his belief, steering him down an unexpected path. Edward's wife, Melinda, was a woman of profound faith and intellect. A biochemist by profession, her scientific acumen was as sharp as her spiritual convictions. Her ability to weave together the intricate details of molecular biology with the grand teachings of the Catholic Church never ceased to perplex him. To him, Melinda's deep involvement in church activities, her regular attendance at Mass, and her morning rosary were enigmatic, almost contradictory to her scientific background. Then there was his close friend Thomas, a professor of philosophy at the local university. Thomas was known for his brilliant lectures on existentialism and ethics, drawing on thinkers like Sartre and Aquinas. Despite his vast knowledge and critical approach to most subjects, Thomas was a devout Catholic, often engaging in theological discussions and actively participating in parish life. His intellectual prowess, combined with an unwavering faith, was something that Edward found both admirable and truly confounding. For Edward, these two individuals represented a dichotomy that he struggled to reconcile. Their devotion to a faith he deemed filled with fairy tales was a puzzle he felt compelled to solve. It was this very conundrum, the presence of devout faith in the lives of two highly intellectual beings, that fueled his decision to write. He saw his upcoming book as more than just a creative outlet. It was a necessary exploration, an attempt to understand and perhaps in his own way save Melinda and Thomas from what he considered delusions of faith. Sitting in the comforting ambiance of the pub, Edward began to outline his thoughts. The clink of glasses and the low hum of conversations around him provided a familiar backdrop. As he delved into the depths of his skepticism, his aim was clear: to use his expertise in science as a foundation to challenge the very tenets of Catholicism that Melinda and Thomas so fervently embraced. In the comforting dim of the pub, with a pint by his side, Edward opened his laptop and began typing. The first words of his book were filled with a confidence born of skepticism. His goal was clear: to articulate why faith, particularly the Catholic faith, was incompatible with reason and science. Melinda, his wife, often discussed her research in biochemistry, finding parallels between scientific discoveries and biblical teachings. Edward admired her intelligence, yet he couldn't fathom how such a rational mind could accept religious doctrines without empirical evidence. Similarly, his philosophical debates with Thomas always ended at an impasse, with Edward unable to grasp how Thomas reconciled his vast knowledge with unwavering spiritual belief. Determined to provide a rational explanation for his skepticism, Edward began to delve into scientific literature. He intended to draw from molecular biology, his field of expertise, to disprove religious claims, particularly those surrounding the concept of miracles. However, as he sifted through scientific journals and texts, he stumbled upon a series of articles that challenged his preconceptions. One evening, as Edward read about the complexities of the human genome and the complexities of cellular mechanisms, he experienced a moment of awe. The elegant design and intricate balance of life at the molecular level seemed to hint at something beyond mere chance. This was not a revelation of faith, but it planted a seed of doubt in his mind about the absoluteness of his disbelief. Over the following weeks, Edward found himself increasingly drawn to literature that bridged science and spirituality. He read about scientists who, despite their empirical backgrounds, found harmony between their scientific understanding and spiritual beliefs. These accounts were not from fringe scientists, but from respected figures in the scientific community. He found his skepticism softening, giving way to a sense of wonder he hadn't felt since childhood. The more he read, the more he realized that science and faith might not be the adversaries he always believed them to be. Instead, they appeared as two lenses through which the wonder of the universe could be understood. Edward's journey of skepticism began to take an unexpected turn as he delved deeper into the realms of science that he had always believed stood in opposition to faith. Each evening at the pub, what started as an endeavor to debunk religious beliefs gradually transformed into a quest for understanding. One of the concepts that caught Edward's attention was the Higgs boson, often referred to as the God particle. This elusive particle, integral to the standard model of particle physics, imbues other particles with mass. Its discovery was a monumental event in physics, yet its nickname intrigued Edward. The term God particle, coined somewhat facetiously by the media, hinted at the particle's significance in the creation and structure of the universe. For Edward, this was a symbolic representation of the intersection between the physical laws of the universe and the metaphysical questions posed by religion. Another concept that challenged Edward's perspective was the principle of fine-tuning in the universe. He learned how certain fundamental physical constants in the universe are precisely calibrated, allowing for the existence of life. Any slight variation in these constants, and the universe would have been hostile to the development of life. This precision seemed to Edward less like random chance and more like deliberate design, a concept that resonated with the arguments made by many theistic scientists. As Edward explored further, he came across the anthropic principle, which posits that the universe appears to be finely adjusted for the existence of life. This principle did not offer definitive proof of a divine creator, but it did suggest that the universe was more than just a random assemblage of particles and forces. It was during these nights at the pub, immersed in his research, that Edward began to feel a shift within himself. The skepticism that had been a cornerstone of his identity was now being eroded by the elegance and complexity of the universe as revealed through science. He found himself marveling at the mysteries of existence, which science alone could not fully explain. As Edward's personal journey into the mysteries of science and faith deepened, he became aware of an intriguing global phenomenon. Across the world, scholars, scientists, thought leaders, and even celebrities, individuals renowned for their intellect and influence, were experiencing a wave of spiritual awakenings. These conversions to Christianity and Catholicism were happening at a remarkable rate, drawing attention from various corners of the globe. One notable figure that caught Edward's attention was Dr. Francis Collins, a geneticist of high repute and the director of the National Institutes of Health. Collins, once an atheist, had journeyed to belief, finding harmony between his scientific pursuits and his newfound Christian faith. His book, The Language of God, in which he articulated how he saw no conflict between science and faith, resonated deeply with Edward. Another example was C.S. Lewis, a revered author and academic. Known for his staunch atheism in his early years, Lewis's transition to becoming one of the most influential Christian writers of his time was a story of intellectual and spiritual transformation that intrigued Edward. In the realm of celebrities, Edward learned of Jonathan Rumi, the actor known for his portrayal of Jesus in the series The Chosen. Rumi's deep Catholic faith and his articulation of it in interviews were examples of how belief and career could intertwine gracefully. Each story was unique, yet there was a common thread, a pursuit of truth that led to an unexpected embracement of faith. This growing trend seemed to juxtapose Edward's shifting perspective, as if mirroring his internal conflict on a global scale. It was as if the world of reason and the realm of faith were not parallel lines that never met, but rather intersecting paths leading to a fuller understanding of life and existence. Edward found the synchronicity between his personal revelations and the global trend of intellectual conversions both startling and affirming. It was a sign that his journey was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader narrative of reconciliation between faith and reason. As Edward continued to immerse himself in scientific literature that slowly nudged him towards a broader understanding of faith and reason, he began to observe his wife Melinda and his friend Thomas with renewed interest. Their spirited theological discussions, which he had previously dismissed as intellectual meanderings, now piqued his curiosity. Melinda and Thomas would often engage in deep conversations about complex theological concepts like predestination and redemptive suffering. Edward noticed the intellectual vigor and enthusiasm with which they debated these topics. Melinda, in particular, often expressed how her return to the church had reignited an intellectual stimulation she felt was absent in secular life. She viewed the secular world as intellectually lacking compared to the rich and challenging terrain of theological contemplation. To Melinda, the Bible wasn't just a religious text, but a profound study of the human condition. She believed that understanding the narratives and psychological insights within the scriptures was akin to mastering the complexities of human nature. This perspective was a stark contrast to Edward's view, where he saw religious practices like Lenten fasting as mere tools of control and brainwashing. However, Edward's exposure to the global trend of intellectual conversions and his deepening understanding of the intersection between science and faith began to shift his perspective. He started to see Melinda and Thomas's engagement with theology not as a surrender of intellect, but as an exercise in intellectual depth and discipline. Melinda's explanation of fasting and other religious practices as opportunities for self-discipline resonated with Edward. He began to appreciate that these practices weren't about mindless adherence, but about developing self-control, which could then be applied to other aspects of life, including his professional work. This shift in perspective was gradual but profound. Edward found himself drawn into their discussions, asking questions, and even challenging some of his long-held beliefs. The more he listened and engaged, the more he recognized the intellectual richness of theological discourse. It was a realization that faith and reason could coexist, and that exploring theological mysteries could be an intellectually fulfilling endeavor. Edward's journey was evolving, from a quest to disprove religion using science to an exploration of how science and faith could complement each other. This new openness to understanding faith intellectually was the beginning of a significant transformation in his life. As Edward found himself increasingly drawn into the theological discussions between Melinda and Thomas, his approach to writing his book underwent a subtle transformation. No longer was it a project rooted in disproving religious beliefs. It became an exploration of understanding them. One evening, as the trio sat together at the pub, the conversation turned to the topic of grace and free will. Edward listened intently as Melinda and Thomas exchanged thoughts on how divine grace doesn't undermine human freedom, but rather enhances it. The discussion was rich with philosophical and theological insights, challenging Edward's preconceptions about the restrictive nature of religious doctrine. This newfound engagement with theological concepts began to influence Edward's relationship with Melinda. He started to see her not just as his loving wife, but also as a source of profound intellectual and spiritual insight. Her deep faith, far from being a simplistic acceptance of dogma, was a well-considered stance that integrated her scientific knowledge with her spiritual beliefs. Edward's writing sessions at the pub became periods of reflection and inquiry rather than skepticism and rebuttal. He found himself researching not just to refute, but to understand. Articles about the harmony between quantum physics and spiritual mysticism, the philosophical arguments for the existence of God, and the historical evidence supporting biblical events were now part of his reading list. This intellectual openness led to a subtle yet significant shift in Edward's inner world. The rigid boundaries he had erected between science and faith began to blur. He started to appreciate the complexity and depth of religious beliefs and practices, seeing them as more than mere rituals, but as pathways to deeper understanding and discipline. Edward's journey was not a sudden leap into faith, but a gradual awakening to the possibilities of a world where science and spirituality coexisted. His conversations with Melinda and Thomas became less about debate and more about exploration, less about winning arguments and more about seeking truth. As Edward continued to write, his book evolved from a critique of religion into a narrative of his journey, a journey that mirrored the larger global trend of intellectual exploration of faith. It was a story not just of skepticism, but of discovery, not just of questioning, but of finding unexpected answers. Edward's journey of intellectual and spiritual exploration reached a turning point on a rainy evening at the pub. As he sat there, immersed in a book about the historical evidence of Jesus' life, something stirred within him. The book wasn't just an academic exercise. It was a compelling narrative that wove together archaeological findings, historical records, and theological insights. For the first time, Edward found himself considering the possibility that the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ were more than just symbolic stories. That night, the conversation with Melinda and Thomas took a different turn. Edward brought up his recent readings, expressing his astonishment at the depth of historical and scientific evidence that underpinned the Christian faith. Melinda listened, her eyes reflecting a mixture of surprise and joy. Thomas, ever the philosopher, engaged Edward in a discussion about the intersection of faith and history, encouraging him to delve deeper into the mysteries of Christianity. The days that followed were a period of intense reflection for Edward. He began to visit the local church, not for Mass, but to sit in quiet contemplation. The stained glass, the statues, the very walls of the church seemed to speak to him, whispering stories of faith, sacrifice, and redemption. In this sacred space, Edward found a tranquility he hadn't known he was seeking. As the spring approached, the conversation about renewing their vows in the church came up. Melinda had always expressed her desire for a church wedding, and Edward had always been indifferent. But now something within him had shifted. The idea of standing before God and renewing their vows took on a new meaning. He began to see it not as a mere religious formality, but as a profound expression of commitment and faith. Edward's book, too, was transforming. It was no longer a skeptic's critique, but a seeker's journey. He wrote about his experiences, his conversations, and his growing understanding that science and faith, far from being adversaries, were complementary paths to understanding the human experience. The culmination of Edward's journey came unexpectedly. One quiet morning, as he sat in the church lost in thought, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace and connection. It was as if all the intellectual arguments, the historical evidence, and the philosophical discussions had coalesced into a moment of clarity. In that moment, Edward felt a deep, inexplicable connection to something greater than himself, a presence that was both comforting and humbling. As the church wedding approached, Edward found himself reluctantly agreeing to attend the required marriage class. To him, it initially seemed like an unnecessary formality, a mere procedural hurdle, and if we're being honest, a money grab. After all, he and Melinda had been living together harmoniously for 5 years. What more could a class teach them about their relationship? His friend Thomas, sensing Edward's resentment, offered a different perspective. Over a quiet conversation at the pub, Thomas explained that the marriage class wasn't just about conflict resolution or communication skills. It was an opportunity for Edward to understand what it meant to be a Catholic husband, especially to a devout wife like Melinda. Thomas spoke of the spiritual responsibilities that came with being the head of a Catholic household. It was more than just providing and caring. It was about spiritual leadership and support. He mentioned the power of blessing one's spouse, of being a source of spiritual strength and guidance. This conversation was a revelation for Edward. He had never considered the spiritual dimension of his role as Melinda's husband. The idea that he could offer her something more, that he could contribute to her spiritual well-being, was both humbling and uplifting. With this new understanding, Edward began to approach the marriage class with a sense of purpose. He listened attentively, engaged with the material, and even found himself enjoying the discussions and exercises. Melinda noticed the change in him, the openness with which he embraced the teachings of the class. It brought them closer, not just as partners in life, but as companions in faith. The marriage class became a space for Edward to explore and understand the nuances of a Catholic marriage. It also allowed him to reflect on his own spiritual journey, how far he had come from his days of skepticism. As the class progressed, Edward found that it wasn't just about preparing for a church wedding. It was preparing for a marriage that was enriched by faith. It was about understanding how to be a partner to Melinda in every sense, emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually. Meanwhile, Edward's book was nearing completion. It had become a memoir of sorts, a testament to his journey from skepticism to belief, from intellectual curiosity to spiritual awakening. It chronicled his struggles, his revelations, and his gradual transformation. The day of the church wedding arrived, a crisp spring morning that held the promise of new beginnings. Edward stood at the altar awaiting Melinda. As he gazed at the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the pews, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. Once a place of mere architectural beauty, the church now held a deeper significance for him. Melinda walked down the aisle, radiant and serene. Edward looked at her, seeing not just his wife, but his partner in a journey of faith that had unexpectedly become his own. The ceremony was intimate and profound, with readings and hymns that resonated with the couple's shared spiritual journey. During the ceremony, Edward found himself deeply moved by the rites and prayers, feeling a sense of belonging he had never anticipated. The vows they exchanged felt like a reaffirmation of their love, now enriched by a shared faith and understanding. The reception that followed was a celebration not just of their union, but of Edward's journey. The church family, who had witnessed his transformation, shared in the joy and wonder of the occasion. Thomas, acting as the best man, gave a toast that gently alluded to Edward's journey from skepticism to faith, drawing laughter and nods of acknowledgement from those who knew the story. Meanwhile, Edward's memoir, titled From Doubt to Faith, A Skeptic's Journey, was finally complete. It was a candid and thoughtful account of his intellectual and spiritual exploration. The book detailed his initial skepticism, the scientific and philosophical readings that challenged his beliefs, the influence of Melinda and Thomas, and his eventual acceptance of faith. As the book hit the shelves, Edward found himself a role he had never imagined, that of an author whose story could inspire others grappling with questions of faith and reason. He received messages from readers who found solace and inspiration in his journey, some embarking on their own quest for understanding. The story of Edward's transformation was more than just a personal victory. It was a testament to the power of open-minded exploration and the unexpected paths life can take. His journey had begun with a quest to disprove faith through science, but had led him to a place where science and faith coexisted, enriching each other. Edward's story, like his marriage to Melinda, was a celebration of love, truth, and the endless possibilities that open up when one dares to question, seek, and ultimately believe.